We just finished talking about Wacom tablets and additional brush settings. Now let's go into talking about my favorite topic, which is layers and masks. So I opened up another image in Photoshop just to keep things fresh from our Dixie Dixon tutorial. Now make sure that before we begin, have your brush selected, since this is going to be about masking and layers. Secondly, make sure that you hit the D key for defaults, and you have window and brush selected, as well as layers and properties, because those are the three things that we ultimately need in this tutorial. Okay, so now under our brush, the main thing that I mentioned is we're going to turn it off from our previous section, and I explained why there. So we have our shape dynamics turned off, and the others I'm going to keep as is. So whatever you have it set to, leave as defaults, because they're more for additional painting and things like that. Now to close it again, you can go under Close Tab Group and it'll close off. Now, let's go into explaining what a layer is. As we had before, and you can use your Wacom tablet or your mouse or your trackpad, either one will work for this tutorial. Just to explain what this is, because it's common between whatever it is that you use. So what a layer is something that allows you to separate your brush strokes or separate your actions so that you can undo them, redo them, or keep them somewhere in between. We call it non-destructive editing. And we call it non-destructive editing because if you start working on your image itself, it stays permanent. And you have to keep going back every single step to modify it. So it becomes less flexible and less editable. For instance, we take our brush, and as before, we started brushing on our canvas. Now, what if you wanted to move those brush strokes to the other side? You couldn't do it. What if you wanted to minimize those brush strokes just on his face? You couldn't do it. With layers, it allows you to completely customize how fluid your brush strokes are and how you can customize it. Let's go and undo that. Now, layers are located under your layers palette. So now it makes sense. We're getting these palettes more usable and we're getting through them. So under layers, we can add a blank layer, which is completely invisible. It has no contents in it. And we can paint on it or draw on it or do many things. So for instance, under this icon here, under your layers palette at the bottom right, you'll see this new page icon. This new page icon adds a layer on top of the background. So what we want to do is do the same thing we did by drawing on top of our subject. Except this time, we don't have to undo everything if we don't want to. We can do a few really cool things. The first thing that I want to show you is we can change how visible it is. By visibility, I mean the word opacity. Opacity is located in your layers palette on the top right, which is at 100% by default all the time. If I drag it down, notice what happens on the screen. I'll zoom in here with my shortcut, and we can start seeing some of the subject behind that person. How cool is that? So aside from being able to just change the opacity, we can also change a few other things. For example, we can move the brushstroke that we just did to another location. The reason I'm showing you all this isn't because we're necessarily going to be painting on a person, but showing the fundamentals of how a layer works, how to navigate and operate it, so that when we actually start working on images, you'll be able to see and understand exactly what we did without having to re-explain everything. The way we actually move the contents of the layer itself is by your shortcut V on your keyboard changes to this Move tool. This Move tool allows me to move the contents freely. Once you move the contents, you're not stuck to the individual location that you drew it in. The other cool part about layers is that you can add more than one of them. For instance, I can click on another layer. I can go back to my brush tool, change the color of the brush, hit OK, and start brushing. And then when I go back to this V key, it allows me to move it independently. Let's say that I have layer 2 selected. That is the only layer that's going to move whenever I move my layer itself. I like keeping that as my default setting because sometimes I have multiple layers, and if I know exactly what layer my contents are on, I just have to click on that layer on my layers palette and then move it. However, another option is with the V key enabled, which is the move tool, and it looks different with the icon depending on what Photoshop version you have. You can hit auto select and then layer, and what that does is it's going to move the layer that I click on. So if I click over the blue brush stroke, it's going to move that. If I click on the black brush stroke, it selects the layer that the black brush stroke is on and moves that. So depending on how you want to operate, you can change it accordingly. For me, I like leaving it unselected by default because it's much more easier to navigate. And the same thing works with opacities on multiple layers. If I stack them on top of each other and I lower the opacity, you'll notice that it becomes transparent as well. And I can see underneath to the bottom. And I can change the opacity on the layer at the bottom. And it adjusts accordingly. If you want to, say, for example, adjust the layer aside from just moving it around, we can transform it. Let's say I'll delete that layer by hitting delete on my keyboard. And I'll delete this one as well. I'll add a new layer. And then I'll start making a blue circle in the middle. Let's say that we want to add shapes coming out of it. Let's say that instead of moving this, we wanted to transform it and rotate it. Well, that's actually very easy to do. If you go to Edit and Free Transform, this box comes up around the layer contents. So the way this works is very simple. If you hover your cursor around the box without actually clicking anything, it gives you indicators of what's going to happen when you start clicking. So if I come to the top corner here and click and rotate, you'll start seeing the canvas rotate. Let's say that you want to make it smaller. You can take the end and drag it down and scale it to however you want. The other cool tool is if you want to scale it proportionately, you can hold the content down and hold Shift. And what happens is it scales down proportionately based on your width and height ratio. If you want all the ends to come together at the same time, hold Shift and Option or Alt, and you can scale it in the center. Another command is you can grab the point in the middle, drag it to any area, say one of the ends over here, and then when I hold Shift and Option, it scales according to the center point. So I'm holding Shift and Option and scaling. So there's a lot of functions that Photoshop allows you to do. For instance, if I also hit Command and grab the endpoint, or Control on your PC, what happens is it distorts and changes perspective. So try playing with different modifiers of your keyboard and with the endpoints, and you'll see exactly what happens. And hitting Escape undoes everything that you just did. So again, Command T to transform, and then scaling the object or layer depending on what size you want it. A practical application of this is say you start adding effects in the photograph and you start bringing in elements of other photographs and you want to scale them down for size, maybe for perspective purposes. You can bring it in and scale it and then put it in the photo. Now that we understand what layers are, let's talk a little bit about masking as well. So let's pretend that we want to add a new layer, and I'll draw something else as well. Let's say that I want to start adding some color around her. And we realize that we don't want the color affecting everything. We want a way to be able to erase temporarily. So in a way, it's kind of like erasing without making it permanent. So you don't have to do it again and again. That's what masking is. So for instance, now that we have a layer with paint on it, what we can do is add a mask. And a mask is located at the bottom right here where you see this half circle, half rectangle. When I click on it, the first thing that pops up is this white layer looking icon that has a chain clip next to it. This is the mask itself. Now, the reason why we have this mask is so that we can use it, like I said, to erase temporarily. The way this works is very simple. Make sure you have the brush like we've always been doing, except this time we want either white or black. Now, when you hit D for defaults, you can get white or black, and then you can use X to swap the colors. So black is basically going to conceal, and white is going to reveal. So by default, the mask, as you can see, is white because everything is being revealed. Anything that's in the layer itself is visible. If we have this mask selected, so make sure that there's highlights around the mask and not the layer by clicking on it. So click on the mask. Make sure your brush is set to black, and then we'll start by drawing over the area that we painted on. So you can see the pink area is being removed. However, if we want to bring it back, we'll change our brush to white and we'll paint over it again. And what that did is it brought over the exact brush strokes that we had done before. So again, I'm going to switch over to black and start brushing. And you can see I can change my brush size with my keyboard shortcuts. And then erase in just the exact amounts I want. So how do you know what area you've painted black in? Well, if you hold Option and click on the mask, Alter Option, you see the areas that I painted black in. These black areas are basically what's being hidden. For instance, we have our layer and we notice that the only thing pink that's visible is this little square. However, that's because when I look at my mask itself, you'll see that this area of white is the window and everything else around it is being covered like a bandage. So you're not going to see anything on that layer that's being painted black. All you need to do to get out of this view is click on the layer again and you get out of that mask view. Some other really cool functions is with layers itself, you can duplicate layers. So say you like this little pink square for whatever reason. On your keyboard, you can hit Command J, and on the layers palette, you see it's duplicated. So I can move this layer independently, and it makes a copy of it. Another way to duplicate a layer is with your Move tool still selected, hold the Option or Alt key, and click on the layer itself. And what that does is the layer below it, which was layer 1 copy, ends up duplicating, as you can see here. So if I did that again, it'll duplicate again, as well as the mask. So here's the cool part. even though we move that layer and the contents, the mask moves with it because of that chain that's attached to it. The way we can stop doing that is, let's say you want your mask to be held in place, but you want your contents to move. I can simply click on that link. Now when I move my paint strokes, you'll see that the mask itself stays in place while the contents of my brush strokes are moving. So it's kind of trippy when you look at it because it looks like this invisible shield. Let's draw something that makes it look more apparent. So I'll take my brush, select a color like blue or teal, whatever you want to call it. I'll draw a circle, but this time my mask being selected is going to have a hole in the center. So again, it's not deleted, it's just hiding. Now if I uncouple that, change my move tool, and select my layer, you'll see the contents of the layer is being moved around. However, if I select my mask, I can move the mask around. So just depending on what you want to do, there may be circumstances, say you're masking out hair and you want to change the background around the hair, well then you can make sure that the mask doesn't move, but maybe the background changes from somewhere else in the image. So there's a lot of things you can do with this principle and concept. It's very powerful. The other really cool part is masks also have their own opacity. For instance, when we have our properties open, you'll see that there's a density tab. This is primarily available to more recent versions of Photoshop. So if you do not have this in your properties or adjustments, it's because of a recent update that allowed you to do so. So density basically just does that. It allows you to change how intense you want your mask. So you can see here when I change my density, it gets lighter and lighter, and because of which you can see through the object in minor opacities. So density becomes the opacity of your mask. Another really cool feature is the fact that you can also transform the mask. So you can Command T. If I increase that, the mask transforms. So it's not just the layer. The mask itself has its own properties that the layer also has simultaneously. We can also delete the mask itself by selecting the mask and hitting the delete key. And that deletes the layer and the mask itself. Or you can take the mask, drag it down to the delete function, and you can either apply the mask so it permanently punches a hole through the layer, or you can simply delete it, and now you have the layer by itself again. So again, to delete the mask, you definitely have to drag it to the trash can. It won't delete just by clicking on delete. So I'll delete that, and you can undo that as well. Another great function is if you click on the / key, which is above your enter key. Now, some countries don't have this key. There's different shortcuts depending on what country you're from, and unfortunately there's so many that I don't exactly know what the shortcut is for every one of them. However, on the US keyboard, it's this / key. And what that / key does is anywhere that you draw with black, it shows up in red. This is important because sometimes as you're drawing, without that / key, you cannot see exactly where black has been painted and where it hasn't. So for instance, we know that this circle is being masked out, but we don't know exactly where outside the mask has there been any markings unless we physically check by hitting Option and clicking on the mask. So they came up with a shortcut that allows an in-between to see the full image and the mask itself with this red glow that happens by hitting the backslash key. So if I take that off and hit the backslash key again, it turns off. And that's really helpful to know about masking as well. Another really great feature is you can invert a mask. Let me give you an example. Let's say I option click on the mask to show the contents. Now, if I wanted to invert this, so say that everywhere where it's white, I wanted it black. Everywhere where it's black, I wanted it white. I'll hit Command I. It flips the colors. So when I go back to my layer itself, you'll see that if I hit Command I on the mask, it changes. The contents invert. So that's basically how to use a mask, how to combine that with layers, how to duplicate, and how to use that for your advantage when you're stacking different layers together. Now, people always ask me, what if I want to start with a black mask? What if I want to hide all the contents of a layer and selectively bring that back in? I can do that as well. I'll select a new layer. I'll start painting. Let's say I start painting over her glasses. Okay? Now, if I add a mask, it starts out as white and everything's revealed. However, sometimes there are situations where you want to start out with everything being hidden and just a few things being revealed later. So I can paint all over this image and I can hide everything all at once without having to manually paint over everything. And the easy way to do that is either two ways. I can add the mask with the mask button and then hit Command I. Or if I delete that mask, I'll delete that mask. And then when I hold, what was that button? When I hold Option and then click on the thumbnail, it starts out as a black mask. You're going to understand why this is so critical as we go forward into other topics like adjustment layers. But for now, keep that in mind. Now, I want to talk a little bit about how to rename layers, how to keep things color coordinated, groups, things of that nature. Let's say you have a layer where you've drawn something on it. Maybe you have multiple layers. So I have 3 layers here with different objects in each. Let's say I want to move them all at once. How do I do that? I can hold Shift and then click on the first layer and then the last layer, and it selects all of them at once. Now when I have my Move tool, it moves everything together. Another really cool way is if I hold Shift and select all of them, I can hit Command G or Control G, and it adds it to a folder. What this folder does, it has a drop-down menu which shows you all the layers that are within that folder. If I move just that folder, it moves everything within that folder. I can also add masks to that folder and then do the same thing with my mask. Paint with a black brush and hide everything. And so nothing's visible, which makes you really easy to organize and keep things clutter-free. And you can add mini groups if you want. You can even add a group without layers. The icon's right below it. Create a new group, so there's nothing in it. If I click on the group itself, I then click on the layer icon, which goes straight into the group itself. So anything I do in this group is independent from everything else. So I can then move the group itself, and it's completely independent from the objects in the other group. Now, when it comes to renaming layers itself, all you need to do is double click on the name of the layer and rename it to anything that you want. You can also change a few things. Maybe you want a bigger thumbnail. You can right click on the thumbnail and then click on medium thumbnail, large thumbnail, or you can go no thumbnail. I usually like to keep it as small or medium, depending on how much size I have. And I can also click on this object here, which says clip thumbnails to layer bounds. What that does is, as you can see, all the contents of my layers fit inside the thumbnail. So it gives you a really crystal clear view in case there's something really small in the layer and you can't see it. Another cool feature is you can change the color of the layer. I can right click on the eye, change it to red, change it to orange, whatever it is that you want. So maybe you have a layer where you've done some healing work or cloning work where you've removed an object. So you want to color code them for people to know. Maybe you have certain elements that are in one layer, not the other. You can categorize them that way. Sometimes you want to be able to go in and make only one layer visible in a stack of layers. That's also very easy to do. Hover over these eyes, hold Option, and then click on just that layer itself. And when you click it again with Option held down, it brings everything back up again. So it makes things really easy if you want to see contents of just that single layer temporarily. The one last option we're going to go over is the selection tool. Now the selection tool is very helpful when you combine that with layers. For example, I'll have an object here. Let's say I want to move just a part of that object without moving everything. There's this marquee tool here, which is rectangular, circular, or single pixel columns. Click on the rectangular marquee tool by holding down the icon until it pops up with a menu. And what this does is you can drag it across the canvas to select just the part of the layer that you want to move. Now, when I select the Move tool, it cuts it in half and moves it somewhere else. Now, if I want to deselect these marching ants that are going across the image, I'll just hit Command D. It unselects. Or you can go Select and Deselect. If I want to select everything within the layer itself, I can hit Command, hover over the thumbnail, and click on the thumbnail itself, and it'll generate a marquee around the contents of the layer. Now, I know I showed you quite a lot of things that you could do with layers, but there's a couple of things that I really want you to take away for now that is the most important. Number one, being able to know how to make a layer, which is your layer icon at the bottom. The second thing is being able to know how to draw on that layer, which is with your brush tool, and drawing in it. Third thing, being able to move those contents. The fourth thing, adding a mask. And also being able to use that mask, what it is that it does. Remember, a white mask does nothing. But when you start drawing with black, it hides whatever contents are connected to that layer itself. Next, you should know how to invert a mask. So say I have a white mask starting completely fresh by undoing our brush stroke, making sure that the mask is selected, Command I changes everything to black, meaning it hides all the contents. And lastly, know how to duplicate a layer, hitting Command J, which duplicates that same layer that you were on previously. And then finally, being able to add a group, which is the group icon, and also modifying that group by dragging layers into that group or adding a mask on that group itself. So for instance, I can take one of the layers, drag it until it hovers over the group, and letting it go. What that does is, because there's an indentation in the column, it shows you that it fit into the group itself. Once you're able to work with a layer and a layer mask, you'll realize that's ultimately the hardest thing about using Photoshop and layers. Keep on practicing, because once you understand what that is, you will be able to do almost anything you want with Photoshop effects when it comes to retouching and editing the photo. Now that we've finished layers and layer mask and groups, we're going to take a step further and go into keyboard shortcuts to make Photoshop and using the tools much simpler for you.